The autumn of 1912 brought unexpected revelations to the quiet township of Millbrooks in Pennsylvania. Local historian Margaret Whitmore had been cataloging donated materials for the county archive when she discovered a leather-bound journal wedged behind a false panel in an old presbytery desk. The volume bore no external markings save for water stains and the unmistakable patina of age that spoke of decades in darkness. The journal's pages, yellowed and brittle, contained entries spanning 3 years in the late 19th century. Written in a careful hand using fading ink, the text belonged to Father Edmund Thorne, who had served the remote parish of St. Bartholomew's from 1887 until his mysterious disappearance in 1890. Church records indicated that Father Thorne had simply vanished one October morning, leaving behind only his breviary and a note requesting forgiveness for unnamed transgressions. What distinguished this particular diary from typical clerical writings was its increasingly erratic tone and disturbing observations. The early entries documented routine pastoral duties, weather patterns, and correspondence with the diocesan office. However, as the months progressed, Father Thorne's writing revealed a growing preoccupation with unexplained phenomena occurring within his isolated mountain parish. His descriptions grew more detailed and troubling with each passing season. The final entries, dated just days before his disappearance, contained references to the congregation that gathers in darkness and voices that speak in tongues unknown to Scripture. These cryptic phrases were accompanied by crude sketches in the margins, depicting symbols that bore no resemblance to traditional Christian iconography. The handwriting itself deteriorated noticeably, transforming from neat clerical script into an increasingly frantic scrawl that suggested profound psychological distress. Margaret Whitmore's initial examination revealed that several pages had been deliberately removed from the journal, their remnants still visible along the binding. The missing sections corresponded to critical periods mentioned in the remaining text, creating gaps that only deepened the mystery surrounding Father Thorne's final months. The deliberate nature of these omissions suggested either self-censorship or the intervention of another party seeking to conceal specific information. Local church authorities, when contacted about the discovery, expressed reluctance to discuss Father Thorne's tenure or the circumstances of his departure. Bishop Morrison, representing the diocesan office, acknowledged that certain irregularities had been noted in Father Thorne's final reports, but declined to elaborate on their nature. This institutional silence only served to heighten speculation about what had transpired in the remote mountain parish during those troubled years. The physical condition of the journal itself provided additional clues to its troubled history. Certain pages bore stains that appeared organic in nature, while others showed evidence of exposure to extreme heat. Most disturbing were the sections where the ink had been deliberately obscured, as if someone had attempted to render specific passages illegible. These alterations suggested that the journal had been examined and modified after Father Thorne's disappearance. As word of the discovery spread through academic circles, requests for access to the document began arriving from universities and research institutions across the eastern seaboard. However, the Allegheny County Historical Society, citing concerns about the journal's fragile condition and sensitive religious content, restricted access to a select group of qualified researchers. This decision would prove prescient, as subsequent examination revealed details that challenged conventional understanding of the period's religious practices. St. Bartholomew's Church stood in a valley 20 miles northeast of Pittsburgh, accessible only by a winding mountain road that became impassable during winter months. The parish had been established in 1875 to serve the scattered farming communities and mining settlements that dotted the rugged landscape. Father Thorne arrived in 1887 as the third priest assigned to the remote posting, his predecessors having requested transfers after brief tenures, citing the isolation and harsh conditions. The diocesan archives contained sparse documentation regarding Father Thorn's background prior to his assignment. Born in County Cork, Ireland, he had immigrated to America in 1882 and completed his seminary training at St. Vincent's in Latrobe. His superiors described him as scholarly and devout, though somewhat reserved in temperament. The assignment to St. Bartholomew's was considered appropriate for a priest who preferred solitary study to the social demands of urban ministry. Father Thorn's early correspondence with the diocesan office reflected the typical concerns of rural clergy: maintaining the church building, managing limited finances, and ministering to a congregation scattered across difficult terrain. His reports noted the particular challenges posed by the area's mixed population of Irish immigrants, German settlers, and descendants of the original Scots-Irish pioneers. Each group maintained distinct cultural traditions that occasionally conflicted with standard Catholic practices. The first indication of unusual circumstances appeared in a letter dated March 1888, where Father Thorn mentioned peculiar local customs that require careful navigation. He described encountering families who practiced what he termed hybrid devotions, combining Catholic rituals with older traditions brought from the old country. While such syncretism was not uncommon in immigrant communities, Father Thorn's tone suggested these practices extended beyond typical folk Catholicism into territory that concerned him professionally. By autumn of 1888, Father Thorn's reports began referencing nocturnal gatherings that occurred in the woods surrounding the parish. He initially dismissed these as harmless social events among the isolated farming families, perhaps harvest celebrations or traditional storytelling sessions. However, his correspondence indicated growing unease as he observed that these gatherings coincided with unexplained absences from Sunday services and a general reluctance among parishioners to discuss their activities during confession. The winter of 1888-1889 marked a significant shift in Father Thorn's official communications. His reports became shorter and more formal, omitting the personal observations and pastoral reflections that had characterized his earlier writing. When questioned by diocesan officials about this change, he attributed it to the demanding nature of winter ministry in such an isolated location. However, private notes found in the journal revealed a different explanation for his growing reticence. Father Thorn's diary entries from this period described increasing difficulty sleeping due to sounds emanating from the forest during the darkest hours of night. He characterized these disturbances as chanting in languages that predate Latin and noted that they seemed to originate from the direction of an ancient stone circle that local residents claimed had been constructed by the area's original inhabitants. His attempts to investigate these nocturnal activities were consistently thwarted by the treacherous terrain and his parishioners' evasive responses to his inquiries. The final official correspondence from Father Thorn, dated September 1890, contained a formal request for reassignment based on irreconcilable differences with local practices. The letter's carefully neutral language concealed the mounting crisis documented in his private writings, where he described feeling increasingly isolated and questioning his ability to provide effective spiritual guidance to a community that seemed to operate according to principles he could neither understand nor accept. The residents of the mountain communities served by St. Bartholomew's maintained a complex relationship with their Catholic faith that reflected generations of adaptation to harsh circumstances. Many families trace their ancestry to the earliest European settlers who had carved homesteads from the wilderness in the mid-18th century. These pioneers had brought with them religious traditions that predated formal church structures, creating a foundation of belief that proved remarkably resistant to institutional modification. Father Thorn's diary revealed his growing awareness that Sunday services represented only a fraction of his parishioners' spiritual activities. He noted that certain families attended Mass with particular intensity during specific seasons, while remaining notably absent during others. This pattern initially puzzled him, as it did not correspond to the traditional liturgical calendar or any recognizable cultural observances from the immigrants' countries of origin. His attempts to understand these patterns led to careful observation of his congregation's behavior during services. Father Thorn documented subtle signs that suggested the presence of alternative spiritual practices, unusual amulets worn beneath clothing, whispered conversations in dialects he could not identify, and a tendency for certain individuals to position themselves near specific architectural features of the church. These observations accumulated over months, creating a picture of a community that had adapted Catholic worship to accommodate older spiritual needs. The priest's growing unease intensified when he discovered that several prominent families maintained what appeared to be private chapels on their properties. These structures, which he glimpsed during pastoral visits, contained religious imagery that blended Christian symbols with motifs he could not readily categorize. When he inquired about these installations, he received explanations that emphasized family traditions and the practical necessity of worship during harsh weather. But the defensive tone of these responses suggested deeper significance. Father Thorn's diary entries from the summer of 1889 described his discovery of a pattern in the timing of these private observances. The nocturnal gatherings he had noted earlier appeared to follow a calendar based on astronomical events rather than Christian holidays. The summer solstice, in particular, seemed to hold special significance for his parishioners, who demonstrated marked changes in behavior during the weeks surrounding this date. Their attendance at regular services decreased, while evidence of alternative activities increased proportionally. The priest's attempts to address these practices directly met with polite but firm resistance. When he raised concerns about the compatibility of certain traditions with Catholic doctrine, his parishioners responded with assurances that their faith remained strong, while maintaining that some customs were too deeply rooted to abandon. This diplomatic stonewalling frustrated Father Thorn, who found himself unable to penetrate the community's careful protection of its secrets. His isolation deepened as he realized that his position as spiritual leader was largely ceremonial. The real religious authority in the community appeared to rest with elderly women who commanded respect that transcended formal church hierarchy. These matriarchs, whom Father Thorn identified only by their initials in his diary, seemed to coordinate the community's spiritual activities according to principles that operated independently of his pastoral guidance. The priest's final entries regarding his congregation revealed a man struggling with the limits of his authority and understanding. He described feeling like an outsider, observing rituals whose significance remained forever beyond his comprehension. This sense of exclusion, combined with his growing awareness of practices that challenged his theological training, created a crisis of confidence that would ultimately contribute to his decision to abandon his post. The stone circle that dominated the highest ridge above St. Bartholomew's Parish had stood for centuries before European settlement reached the Pennsylvania mountains. Local tradition attributed its construction to the indigenous peoples who had inhabited the region, though archaeological evidence suggested a more complex history involving multiple periods of use and modification. Father Thorn's initial curiosity about the structure gradually transformed into an obsession that consumed his final months in the parish. The circle consisted of 13 standing stones arranged in a precise pattern that aligned with various celestial phenomena throughout the year. Each stone bore carved symbols that had weathered over time, but remained partially visible to careful examination. Father Thorn's attempts to document these markings led him to spend countless hours at the site, creating detailed sketches that filled the margins of his diary with increasingly elaborate reproductions of the mysterious iconography. Local residents demonstrated a complex relationship with the stone circle that combined reverence with apparent familiarity. While they spoke of the site with respect bordering on awe, They also displayed knowledge of its properties that suggested regular interaction. Father Thorn noted that certain families made pilgrimages to the circle during specific seasons, carrying offerings that they left among the stones before departing without explanation. The priest's diary documented his discovery that the stone circle served as the focal point for the nocturnal gatherings he had observed from a distance. During the new moon phases, groups of parishioners would climb the ridge to conduct ceremonies that incorporated elements he recognized from Catholic ritual alongside practices that defied his theological understanding. These observations, made from concealed positions in the surrounding forest, provided him with fragmentary glimpses of activities that both fascinated and disturbed him. Father Thorn's attempts to research the historical significance of the stone circle led him to consult with scholars at the University of Pittsburgh and the Carnegie Institute. However, his inquiries yielded little concrete information beyond confirmation that similar structures existed throughout the Appalachian region. The academic community's limited knowledge of these sites frustrated the priest, who sought rational explanations for phenomena that seemed to operate according to principles beyond conventional understanding. The physical effects of prolonged exposure to the stone circle began to manifest in Father Thorn's health and mental state during the summer of 1890. His diary entries describe persistent headaches, disturbed sleep patterns, and vivid dreams that featured imagery consistent with the symbols carved into the ancient stones. These symptoms intensified following his nocturnal visits to the site, suggesting a correlation between proximity to the circle and his deteriorating condition. The priest's final detailed observations of the stone circle revealed his growing conviction that the structure possessed properties that transcended its apparent function as a primitive astronomical calendar. He documented instances of unusual acoustic phenomena where sounds made within the circle seemed to carry farther than physics would suggest possible. Additionally, he noted that certain stones appeared to generate heat during specific weather conditions, creating microclimates that defied rational explanation. Father Thorn's last entry regarding the stone circle, written just days before his disappearance, contained references to voices that speak through stone and ancient wisdom that predates the cross. These cryptic phrases suggested that his prolonged study of the site had led him to conclusions that challenged his fundamental beliefs about the nature of spiritual reality and the exclusive truth of Christian doctrine. The winter of 1889-1890 marked a profound change in Father Thorn's psychological and spiritual condition, as documented through increasingly erratic diary entries that revealed a man grappling with experiences that challenged his understanding of reality. His handwriting, previously neat and controlled, began to show signs of tremor and haste, as if he struggled to record thoughts that came faster than his pen could follow. The priest's sleep patterns deteriorated significantly during this period, with entries describing nights spent in restless wakefulness, punctuated by dreams that seemed more real than his waking hours. These nocturnal visions consistently featured the stone circle and its mysterious symbols, which appeared to pulse with inner light, while voices spoke in languages that predated human speech. Upon waking, Father Thorn found himself able to recall these alien words with disturbing clarity. His relationship with traditional Catholic practices began to show signs of strain as he struggled to reconcile his theological training with the expanding awareness that his experiences had forced upon him. Daily Mass became an ordeal during which he found himself questioning fundamental doctrines, while simultaneously feeling drawn to incorporate elements from the older traditions he had observed among his parishioners. This internal conflict created a crisis of faith that permeated every aspect of his ministry. Father Thorn's physical appearance underwent noticeable changes that concerned the few parishioners who maintained regular contact with him. He lost weight despite maintaining his usual eating habits, and his complexion took on a pallor that suggested chronic illness. Most disturbing were his eyes, which several observers noted had developed an intensity that made direct eye contact uncomfortable. These physical alterations accompanied behavioral changes that further isolated him from his community. The priest's scholarly pursuits expanded beyond traditional theological study to encompass subjects that would have been considered inappropriate for a man of his calling. His diary revealed extensive research into pre-Christian religious practices, ancient astronomical calculations, and the historical significance of stone circles throughout Europe and the Americas. This academic exploration provided him with context for his experiences, but also deepened his sense of alienation from Orthodox Christianity. His correspondence with diocesan authorities became increasingly strained as Father Thorn struggled to explain his growing inability to perform routine pastoral duties. He cited health concerns and the challenging conditions of mountain ministry, but his superiors detected underlying issues that suggested more serious problems. Their offers of assistance and temporary replacement were politely declined, as the priest seemed determined to resolve his difficulties through solitary struggle. The transformation reached its climax during the spring of 1890, when Father Thorn's diary entries began to incorporate symbols and phrases that bore no relationship to any known language or writing system. These additions appeared alongside his normal text, as if he were unconsciously channeling information from sources beyond his conscious awareness. The meaning of these inscriptions remained opaque, but their presence suggested that his contact with the ancient forces surrounding his parish had progressed beyond mere observation. Father Thorn's final coherent entries described a sense of approaching resolution that filled him with both anticipation and dread. He wrote of feeling called to make a choice between the familiar certainties of his former faith and the vast, terrifying possibilities that his experiences had revealed. This decision, he believed, would determine not only his personal destiny, but also his ability to serve the spiritual needs of a community that had always understood truths he was only beginning to glimpse. The last weeks of Father Thorn's documented presence in the parish were marked by diary entries that grew increasingly fragmented and disturbing, suggesting a mind pushed beyond the boundaries of conventional sanity. His writing alternated between moments of crystalline clarity and passages that seemed to emerge from a consciousness no longer entirely his own. The careful theological reasoning that had characterized his earlier entries gave way to observations that defied rational categorization. September 1890 brought a series of entries describing visitations that occurred during the darkest hours before dawn. Father Thorn wrote of figures that appeared in his study, beings that possessed human form but emanated an otherness that made his skin crawl with primitive recognition. These entities communicated without words, conveying information directly into his consciousness through methods that bypassed normal sensory channels. Their messages concerned the true history of the mountain region and humanity's forgotten relationship with forces that predated civilization. The priest's descriptions of these encounters revealed his growing understanding that the stone circle served as more than a primitive calendar or ceremonial site. According to the knowledge being transmitted to him, the structure functioned as a focal point for energies that connected the physical world with dimensions of existence that human science had yet to acknowledge. His parishioners, ancestors, had maintained this connection across generations, preserving traditions that kept ancient pathways open despite the overlay of Christian doctrine. Father Thorn's penultimate entry, dated October 15, 1890, contained his most coherent explanation of the choice that confronted him. He could continue his ministry according to Orthodox Catholic principles, accepting that his experiences represented either hallucinations or demonic deceptions that required exorcism and prayer. Alternatively, He could embrace the expanding awareness that his contact with the ancient forces had provided, accepting a role as bridge between the old wisdom and the new faith that his community had been waiting for him to fulfill. The physical deterioration that had marked his transformation accelerated during these final weeks, with entries describing symptoms that suggested his body was adapting to accommodate consciousness that exceeded normal human parameters. He experienced periods of enhanced perception, during which he could see energy patterns that normally remained invisible, hear conversations occurring miles away, and sense the emotional states of every living creature within the parish boundaries. These episodes left him exhausted, but also exhilarated by the possibilities they revealed. His relationship with the stone circle reached its culmination during the autumn equinox, when Father Thorn participated in a ceremony that he described as the completion of a covenant begun before memory. The details of this ritual remained deliberately vague in his account, but the aftermath left him fundamentally changed in ways that transcended his previous transformation. He wrote of feeling simultaneously more and less than human, as if he had become a conduit for forces that required embodiment to interact with the physical world. The final legible entry in Father Thorn's diary, dated October 20th, 1890, consisted of a single paragraph that served as both explanation and farewell. He acknowledged that his journey had carried him beyond the boundaries of conventional existence, and that his continued presence in the parish would serve neither his own spiritual development nor the needs of his parishioners. The path that lay before him required abandonment of his former identity and acceptance of responsibilities that could not be fulfilled within the constraints of traditional ministry. The diary's last page contained only symbols and markings that bore no resemblance to any known writing system, arranged in patterns that seemed to shift when viewed directly. These inscriptions defied translation or interpretation, serving as a final testament to Father Thorn's complete transformation from Orthodox priest to something that existed beyond the categories of conventional understanding. The official investigation into Father Thorn's disappearance began 3 days after his failure to appear for Sunday services on October 23, 1890. Parishioners who arrived at St. Bartholomew's found the church locked and the presbytery apparently abandoned, with no signs of struggle or hasty departure. The local sheriff, accompanied by several prominent community members, conducted a thorough search of the premises that revealed few clues about the priest's fate or destination. Father Thorn's personal belongings remained undisturbed in the presbytery, including his clerical vestments, breviary, and a substantial collection of theological texts. The only items missing were his diary and a small wooden crucifix that several parishioners remembered him wearing. This selective absence suggested deliberate preparation rather than sudden flight, though the purpose behind such careful planning remained unclear to the investigators. The diocesan authorities dispatched Father Michael O'Brien to conduct a more thorough investigation and assume temporary pastoral duties for the parish. Father O'Brien's initial report described a community that seemed remarkably composed, despite the mysterious circumstances of their priest's disappearance. The parishioners expressed appropriate concern, but demonstrated little surprise, as if they had been expecting such an outcome for some time. Father O'Brien's attempts to gather information about Father Thorn's final weeks met with polite but unhelpful responses from the mountain residents. They acknowledged that their former priest had seemed troubled, but claimed ignorance regarding the specific nature of his difficulties. This collective reticence frustrated the investigating priest, who sensed that the community possessed knowledge they were unwilling to share with outsiders. The search for Father Thorn expanded to include the surrounding wilderness, with volunteer parties combing the mountain trails and remote valleys for any trace of the missing priest. These efforts yielded no concrete evidence, though several searchers reported discovering unusual markings carved into trees and stones throughout the region. The symbols bore resemblance to those found in Father Thorn's abandoned sketches, suggesting a connection between his studies and the landscape itself. Father O'Brien's investigation took an unexpected turn when he discovered the hidden compartment in the presbytery desk that would later yield Father Thorn's diary to Margaret Whitmore. However, the compartment was empty when he found it, leading him to conclude that someone had removed its contents before his arrival. This discovery raised questions about who might have had access to the presbytery and what materials they had sought to conceal. The official church investigation concluded after 6 weeks with a finding of voluntary departure under circumstances unknown. Father O'Brien's final report noted irregularities in the parish that suggested theological difficulties, but stopped short of specifying their nature. The diocese quietly reassigned him to an urban parish, citing his unsuitability for mountain ministry, though his private correspondence revealed deeper concerns about the spiritual atmosphere he had encountered. The mystery of Father Thorn's disappearance gradually faded from official attention, though local residents continued to report occasional sightings of a solitary figure near the stone circle during significant astronomical events. These accounts, dismissed by authorities as folklore or wishful thinking, persisted across generations and contributed to the mountain community's reputation for harboring secrets that outsiders could never fully comprehend. The rediscovery of Father Thorn's diary in 1912 reignited interest in the mysterious circumstances surrounding his disappearance and the unusual spiritual practices of the Pennsylvania mountain communities. Margaret Whitmore's careful documentation of the journal's contents provided researchers with unprecedented insight into the complex religious syncretism that had developed in isolated regions throughout Appalachia during the late 19th century. Academic analysis of the diary revealed patterns consistent with other documented cases of cultural and religious transformation among immigrant communities adapting to frontier conditions. However, Father Thorn's account contained elements that defied conventional anthropological explanation, particularly his descriptions of phenomena that seemed to transcend normal sensory experience. These aspects of his testimony created divisions among scholars regarding the historical value of his observations. The stone circle that had played such a central role in Father Thorn's transformation became the subject of intensive archaeological investigation during the 1920s. Researchers confirmed that the structure predated European settlement by several centuries and showed evidence of continuous use across multiple cultural periods. However, attempts to correlate the site's astronomical alignments with Father Thorn's descriptions of ceremonial activities yielded inconclusive results. The descendants of Father Thorn's original parishioners maintained their characteristic reticence when approached by researchers seeking to verify details from the diary. While they acknowledged the general accuracy of his observations regarding local customs, they declined to provide specific information about practices that they considered private family matters. This protective stance ensured that many aspects of the mountain community's spiritual life remained hidden from academic scrutiny. Father Thorn himself was never found, despite periodic searches conducted by both official investigators and amateur enthusiasts drawn by the mystery surrounding his disappearance. The mountain wilderness contained countless hidden valleys and caves where a determined individual could remain concealed indefinitely, assuming he had survived the harsh conditions and isolation. However, the complete absence of any trace suggested either extraordinary skill in concealment or a fate that removed him entirely from the physical world. The Catholic Church's official position regarding Father Thorn's case evolved over the decades, from embarrassed silence to cautious acknowledgement of the challenges faced by clergy serving in culturally complex environments. His diary became a case study in seminaries for understanding the psychological pressures that could affect priests working in isolation, though the more unusual aspects of his account were typically attributed to stress-induced hallucinations rather than genuine supernatural encounters. Modern paranormal investigators have attempted to recreate Father Thorn's experiences through visits to the stone circle and surrounding areas, with mixed results. Some reported unusual sensory phenomena consistent with his descriptions, while others found nothing beyond the natural beauty and isolation of the mountain landscape. These varying outcomes suggested that whatever forces Father Thorn encountered might be selective in their manifestations or dependent upon specific conditions that remained poorly understood. The ultimate significance of Father Thorn's story lies not in its resolution, but in its demonstration of the complex spiritual landscape that existed in America's remote regions during the period of westward expansion. His diary serves as a reminder that the official narrative of religious development often obscured alternative traditions that continued to flourish beyond the reach of institutional authority, creating spaces where ancient wisdom and modern faith could coexist in ways that challenge conventional understanding of both.